If you grew up near the Appalachian Mountains, you already know. Folks don't just make up stories out here, they remember them. I'd love to know, where are you tuning in from, and what time is it right now? Drop it in the comments. It's wild how many of us are sitting in the dark, listening to the same story, scattered across different corners of the country. Hit the like button and subscribe. It helps more people find their way into these woods, whether they should or not. Let's start. I'm 38 now, but when I was 29 I took contract work as an ecological surveyor. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid enough to keep me fed and gave me an excuse to spend weeks in the backcountry under the kind of skies you don't see in cities anymore. Most of my jobs were routine: logging bird calls, tracking migration routes, setting up acoustic sensors for bats or motion-triggered cameras for predators. I'd done work in the Ozarks, in Colorado foothills, even up in northern Maine. I'd camped alone in grizzly country and snowshoed across frozen ridgelines without seeing another human for a week. Those places had their dangers, sure, but nothing that rattled me the way southeastern Kentucky did one autumn. I still think about that valley more than I should, and I've never written a formal report, not even a personal log, because I couldn't explain it in terms that made sense. That assignment was supposed to be simple. Our team was documenting bobcat and black bear populations around the Red Bird River watershed. Most of the collars were already placed, and the base station near town picked up intermittent signals. My job was solo: hiking along an old survey corridor, mount 3 long-term cameras, camp a couple nights to check transmissions, and haul out with data logs. I parked at a gravel shoulder on a twisting mountain road, the kind with no signage and barely enough space for one truck. My GPS beacon marked the spot, and I shouldered my pack. The trail was an abandoned logging road, half swallowed by moss and fallen branches. You could still see where heavy machinery had once cut through, but the forest had clawed it back, reclaiming its skin. The hiking wasn't bad: 5 miles of steady climb through hemlock groves and laurel thickets. I stopped a few times to take scat samples: deer, raccoon, maybe a fox. I remember thinking how quiet it felt. Not peaceful quiet, but the kind that presses in. No wind, no birdsong, just the crunch of my boots and the blood rushing in my ears. By late afternoon I reached a ledge that looked out across the valley I'd mapped for the cameras. I set camp beneath a rock outcrop, a natural alcove with decent shelter. I unrolled my gear, ate a quick meal, and mounted the first camera along a game trail. Standard stuff. But by sundown, as shadows bled down the slopes, that silence deepened. I kept brushing it off: elevation, maybe seasonal changes, but in the pit of my stomach I knew better. I crashed around 10, my tent flap unzipped for airflow. I woke like a switch had been thrown. No dream, no gradual drift, just instant awareness. My watch read 3:04 a.m. I lay still, ears straining. At first, nothing. Then came the sound. Crunch. A pause. Another crunch. Heavy steps measured. Too slow for a deer, too deliberate for a raccoon. The rhythm was wrong, like something aware of me, circling just beyond the tent's edge. I slid my hand to my flashlight, fingers clumsy with adrenaline. I flicked it on, beam cutting through mesh. Nothing. Just the tree trunks and rock shadows. I unzipped the flap, swept the light in a slow arc. Still nothing, but the forest was suffocatingly silent. No crickets, no owls, not even the faint rush of wind. Only the high-pitched buzz of my lamp, loud in the emptiness. I stayed awake until dawn, stiff as stone. The next day I forced myself back to work. 2 more cameras had to go in, one along a dry creek bed, another deeper in a saddle between ridges. The terrain worsened quickly. Steep drop-offs, loose shale, gullies where rainwater had carved the earth raw. Twice I had to double back to keep my bearings. The GPS cut out more than once, which was normal in deep valleys, but every time it happened, I felt the forest lean closer, as though the trees had shifted behind me when I turned. By mid-afternoon, I had both cameras mounted. On my way back toward camp, I froze. The path I'd used that morning was no longer empty. Right in the center sat a tower of stones, waist high, stacked with surgical care. Moss clung to some, water still damp on others. It hadn't been there before. I didn't touch it, didn't photograph it, just stepped wide around and kept moving. Back at camp, I couldn't bring myself to cook. I ate jerky straight from the bag, boots still laced, knife across my knees. I didn't expect to sleep, and I didn't. Around 1 in the morning it returned. Crunch, crunch, footsteps pacing just outside the halo of my headlamp. I stood, light trembling in my hand. The sound circled slow, deliberate, always beyond the beam's edge. Then it changed. A voice. Not quite human, not quite animal. It was as if speech had been pulled through static, slowed down until vowels warped and consonants dissolved. Long, garbled sounds that weren't words but still carried intent, like someone trying to imitate language without understanding it. My body locked up, knees stiff, throat dry. The voice dragged on, distorted, and then it stopped. Silence heavier than before. Then a single step. Closer. That broke me. I snatched my pack, didn't bother securing anything, and bolted uphill. Branches clawed my arms, rocks shredded my palms, but I didn't stop. The woods blurred. Only when the sky lightened faintly in the east did I collapse, chest heaving, clothes torn, blood slick on my forearms. I staggered back to the truck hours later, started the engine with shaking hands, and drove until pavement steadied beneath me. At the ranger station, I filed the bare minimum. Installed cameras, noted disturbances, possible human interference. Nothing about the voice. Nothing about the stone tower. They nodded, wrote it down, moved on. A week later, the memory cards arrived at our office. Curiosity gnawed at me until I slotted one into the reader. The first night's footage showed raccoons, a couple deer. Normal. The second night, at 1:19 a.m., the feed caught something else. A shape entered frame from the left. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't a person. The skin was pale, almost gray, stretched too thin over a frame that shouldn't have held together. The arms were too long, joints bent wrong. Its head tilted unnaturally as it stepped directly into the camera's view. It stood there for nearly 30 seconds, not moving, not blinking, just staring as if it knew. Then it stepped back, slow, and vanished into the black. I didn't show anyone. I couldn't. Later, over whiskey, an old wildlife tech told me about the Stone Watcher, a local story nobody put in writing. Supposedly, when the Cherokee were forced west, some families hid in those valleys. They marked their dead with cairns so their spirits could find their way back. Over time, the living were forced out, but something stayed behind. Something that mimicked footsteps and voices, building new stacks each season to trick the curious closer. Once it looks at you, he said, it won't forget. I laughed it off, but now, years later, I still wake to the phantom rhythm of deliberate steps pacing my bedroom floor. Once last winter, I found 3 stones balanced neatly on my porch railing, wet from melted frost. I'm 35, and for most of my adult life I've worked as a historical preservation surveyor. That means trudging into forgotten hollows and abandoned ridges, cataloging whatever's left of old structures before someone paves over them or the forest swallows them completely. It's not glamorous work, but it pays the bills, and in some ways it's the only thing that's ever made me feel like I'm piecing together a puzzle bigger than myself. Most people don't care about who lived in these hills 100 years ago, but I always felt like I owed them at least a line in the record. That's how I ended up in eastern Tennessee, not far from the Kentucky border, in a pocket of country they call Larkspur Ridge. It's not on maps, at least not by that name. Locals call it that because in the spring wildflowers choke the meadows, but by August when I was sent in, it looked more like something out of a nightmare. The trees pressed in like a crowd, the air hung heavy, and the road to get there was more a suggestion than a reality. The job was to locate remnants of an old farmstead and mark out boundaries before the county sold the land to a private timber outfit. It was supposed to be routine: take photos, map coordinates, note condition, camp a night or two if necessary. I drove until the road turned to gravel, then dirt, then disappeared into brush. I parked where I could still turn around and hiked in with my gear: maps, a transit level, backup batteries, a tent, and a thermos of bad coffee. The climb wasn't long, but it was eerie. The forest didn't feel alive. No bird chatter, no squirrel rustle, not even insects. Just the sound of my boots crunching dry leaves. A few miles in, I came across a stone chimney. Just that, a chimney, blackened and cracked, standing by itself in a waist-high sea of grass. The rest of the cabin had vanished decades ago. I logged it, snapped photos, and kept moving. The ridge top held the farmhouse, or what was left of it. One room, slanted roof, boards gone silver gray with age. It leaned like it had been exhausted for a century. A single window still held cloudy glass. Inside was a fireplace, collapsed chairs, and enough space for me to roll out my gear if I wanted. I decided to make it a base for the night. That evening I boiled noodles, took a few more measurements, and stretched out on my mat with the lamp low. Around 2 in the morning I woke. At first I thought the rain had started. It had that muffled cadence. But it wasn't rain. It was knocking. 3 sharp raps. A pause. 3 more. The sound came from the wall directly behind my head. I froze. My brain ran through options. Maybe a branch in the wind. Maybe some animal bumping the boards. But it wasn't random. Each knock had the same tone, the same spacing, like someone tapping knuckles in a deliberate rhythm. I crept to the wall, lamp shaking in my hand, and shone the beam through the window. Only fog. A pale curtain that swallowed the trees 20 feet out. Nothing moved. Nothing breathed. After a long minute, I dragged my pack in front of the door and sat awake until morning, knife across my lap. The next day I pressed uphill to log the final boundary markers. That's when I found the rings. They were made of flat stones, carefully placed in circles 20 feet across, each one bare inside. No leaves, no moss, just raw soil like it had been swept clean. I counted 6 before the ridge broke off. My chest tightened when I stepped inside one, like the air thickened and refused to let me fill my lungs. I stumbled back out and gasped until the pressure lifted. I marked them on my GPS and kept moving, but every hair on my arm stood up. Not long after, I heard it, a twig snapping. Not the wind, not a squirrel, too sharp, too heavy. I spun, light sweeping through trees, but nothing was there. My rational mind tried to explain it away, but something deeper whispered I wasn't alone. By dusk I was back at the cabin. I ate jerky cold, too nervous to light another fire. The woods pressed close, silent and waiting. When I finally lay down, I kept the lamp burning low. The knocking came again. This time it came from the floor. 3 raps, pause. 3 more. The cabin had no crawl space, no basement, nothing but dirt beneath the boards. I pressed my ear to the floor and froze. The sound was fainter but steady, like something, or someone was beneath me, scratching or tapping to get out. I didn't move until dawn, when pale light finally crawled through the window. I packed in silence and set out, determined to reach my truck before noon. But the trail wasn't the same. Every flag I'd planted was gone. My GPS spun uselessly, bouncing between directions. Trees looked different, landmarks shifted. The path I'd walked yesterday had dissolved overnight. I picked a slope and forced my way down, reasoning that downhill would eventually lead me to a creek or road. That's when I saw another ring. In the center lay one of my survey flags, shredded, tape hanging in strips as if it had been chewed. I didn't stop to retrieve it. I cut wide around the stones and pushed on. Not long after, another clearing appeared. Another ring. This one held a deer curled unnaturally, stiff as wood. Its eyes stared wide, and its antlers had been snapped off and placed neatly side by side, parallel lines across the bare soil. I gagged and bolted, no longer caring about bearings or maps. At some point, after what felt like hours of stumbling through underbrush, I burst onto a utility road half hidden by vines. I followed it downhill, lungs burning, until my truck appeared like a miracle through the trees. I climbed inside, locked the doors, and sat trembling until I could breathe again. I didn't report much, just boundary notes, GPS coordinates, and a vague mention of abandoned structures. When my supervisor asked if I'd camped overnight, I lied. Said I'd finished in a day. A week later, another guy went out to double-check markers. He lasted 2 nights, came back pale and shaking, handed in his gear, and quit without explanation. Later, over coffee, a local ranger told me something I've never forgotten. Folks around there used to whisper about the knockers of Larkspur. Old miners claimed they were the restless dead, marking their presence with tapping to warn the living away from hollowed ground. The rings, he said, were calling places, spots where the earth was thin and something beneath could reach through. He told me never to step inside one, never to answer a knock, and never to stay on the ridge after dark. I laughed it off in front of him, but I haven't set foot in those mountains since. And sometimes, late at night when I'm home in bed, I'll hear it again. 3 raps. A pause. 3 more. Always faint, as though from beneath the floorboards. Always in rhythm. I tell myself it's the house settling, pipes knocking, imagination running wild. But one morning, not long ago, I found a perfect circle of stones on my back porch. Inside was nothing but bare dirt, swept clean. I'm 36 now, but when I was 31 I worked as a contract surveyor for a small environmental outfit based out of Johnson City. My job was simple: hike into the remote parts of the southern Appalachians, map erosion-prone trails, and record anything that might pose a hazard to hikers. It wasn't glamorous, but it got me out in the woods, away from traffic and phones and all the daily noise. Back then, solitude was the only thing that made me feel steady. That autumn I was assigned to a week-long survey near Big Bald, a stretch of ridgeline not far from the Tennessee-North Carolina border. The kind of place people hike once and never forget. Wide open views, mist pooling in the valleys, ridges rolling away into forever. But my task wasn't the pretty parts. I had to measure runoff cuts, mark overgrowth, and flag sections where signage had been stripped. 5 days of slogging through brush and sleeping on cold ground. I told myself it would be straightforward. I set out on a Monday, parked near the service gate, and hiked in with a light kit. Topo maps, a folding saw, rations, tarp, and my GPS beacon. The first day was uneventful. I pushed nearly 6 miles in before dusk, set up camp near a small clearing, and cooked beans and rice over my little camp stove. The air had that bite you get in the highlands after October, sharp and dry. I remember feeling grateful for the silence as I zipped my bag closed. But sometime after 3 in the morning I woke. What woke me wasn't sound, it was the lack of it. No wind, no insects, not even the soft pop of cooling branches. My ears strained against a silence so deep it made my chest tighten. Then I caught it, breathing. Slow, deliberate, just outside the tarp. Not the heavy sniffing of a bear, not the shuffle of a raccoon. Human. Too steady. Too close. I didn't move. I lay on my back, eyes fixed on the nylon above me, trying to will my heart to quiet down. Whoever it was stood there long enough for me to count the rhythm of their lungs. Then, as suddenly as it started, it stopped. No footsteps, no rustle. Just gone. When the sun finally came, I forced myself out. 10 feet away, pressed into the thin frost, were bare footprints. Clear as day. Broad, flat, larger than mine. No boot treads. No shoes. Just skin and toes. I didn't even bother with breakfast. I shoved everything into my pack and moved. My rational brain screamed prank, hermit, maybe some barefoot hiker who'd wandered too far. But it didn't add up. There weren't any other campsites for miles, and I hadn't seen a soul on the way in. The trail ahead cut through heavy laurel thickets. I kept glancing sideways, half expecting to see a face in the green. Twice I caught more footprints in the mud, angled in the same direction I was heading. Each one deliberate, like whoever it was wanted to be noticed. I pulled out my beacon, thumb hovering over the SOS trigger, but I didn't press it. Maybe pride, maybe stupidity. I told myself I could handle it. That evening I strung my tarp low between 2 hemlocks and sat awake with my knife across my lap. I never slept. All night the woods held their breath, as though even the owls had vanished. By morning, something had shifted. It took me a while to place it. Then it hit me. I hadn't heard a single living thing in hours. Not a bird, not a squirrel. The forest was a vacuum. When I rounded a bend, I saw the first stack, flat stones balanced into a neat tower just off the trail. The kind of thing kids make at creeks. Except this one was too precise. As I went on, more appeared. Rock cairns spaced evenly like silent markers. Then came the twig shapes. Bundles lashed with strips of bark, bent into odd figures. Some dangled from branches. Others were nailed directly into tree trunks with splinters of bone, sharp ends driven deep. I told myself it had to be some backwoods art project, or maybe hunters with a cruel sense of humor. I even snapped a picture with my phone, though my hands trembled so bad the photo blurred. A mile later, I stumbled on the deer. It lay splayed across the center of the trail, skinned with precision. No blood, no mess. Legs gone, ribs flayed open like pages of a book. No predator had done that. The cuts were clean, surgical. I turned back instantly. Forget the assignment, forget the paycheck. I just wanted out, but as I retraced my steps, something else was wrong. Every side trail I passed, trails I knew were open 2 days earlier, was blocked. Trees dragged across, branches stacked high, rocks piled like barricades. Somebody had closed them off deliberately, which meant somebody was behind me watching. The hair on my neck prickled. Each crack of a twig, each crunch of leaf felt too close. I pushed hard, nearly jogging, but the sound of something trailing me never faded. Not rushed, steady, like it had all the time in the world. By nightfall my legs were rubber. I found a rock outcrop with a shallow crawl space beneath and slid under, pressing myself into the dirt. The space was cramped, cold, but at least I could wedge my back against stone and see both directions. I clutched my knife until my knuckles ached. At some point I must have drifted because I woke to humming. A woman's voice, low, lilting. A lullaby without words. It came from just outside the rocks. I froze. She moved slowly along the edge, humming as though to herself, pausing every few steps. Then, right above me, the voice cut to a whisper. "Don't go down the hollow." Clear as speech, right against my ear. I didn't move. I barely breathed. My chest was tight as a vice. The humming faded, then silence returned, thick as a blanket. I waited for daylight before I crawled out. In the soil outside the rock was a single footprint. Bare. Enormous. Toes pressed deep, pointing uphill. I ran the rest of the way. 8 miles without stopping, lungs clawing for air. When I reached my truck, I collapsed against the door and vomited. Only when the engine turned over did I believe I'd actually made it out. A week later, the supervisor told me another guy had been sent in to finish the survey. He made it one night. Came back pale as chalk, swearing someone had thrown stones at his tent from all directions until dawn. Refused to go back. They sealed the trail soon after, citing seasonal maintenance. But I don't believe that. Locals in town sometimes mutter about the Hollow Widow, an old ridgewife who wandered barefoot, marking paths with circles of stone to keep children away from the hollows where she buried her own. They say she still hums when the fog settles, still warns those who bed down where they shouldn't. Some claim it's mercy. Others claim the warning is just the bait, that if you follow her advice, you've already been chosen. I don't know which I believe. What I do know is this. Sometimes at night, when I wake gasping, I hear humming through the walls of my house. A tune without words. And once, on a frosted morning, I found a bare footprint pressed into the dew on my porch, facing inward. When I was 32, I took contract work as a forestry assessor. My job was to hike into parcels of Appalachian land that were being sold, record tree counts, map creeks, and make notes for future development. Most of it was mind-numbingly dull, long hikes, GPS readings, hours alone with notebooks and measuring tapes. But I didn't mind. I've always been more comfortable with trees than people. That fall, I got sent to a place called Ashwood Drain, a steep valley not far from the Tennessee-Virginia line. The county wanted the tract evaluated before auctioning it off to a logging company. On paper, it looked routine, about 200 acres, a couple of ridges, maybe 2 days worth of work if I pushed hard. I figured I'd camp one night, finish in the morning, and be home in time for dinner. The access road was barely more than a rutted path, choked with weeds. I parked where the ground widened enough to turn around and set off uphill with my gear, rangefinder, GPS unit, rolls of flagging tape, and a pack with tent, food, and a radio that rarely worked outside town. The first mile wasn't bad. The old logging cut was still visible if you squinted, though the forest had closed in with laurel and hemlock. I noted tree diameters, sketched the slope grades, and logged coordinates. Normal, but about halfway up, I realized how still everything was. You don't notice forest silence until it's complete. No woodpeckers, no scurrying in the leaves, not even wind through the canopy, just the crunch of my boots and my own breath. After a while, it felt less like quiet and more like being sealed inside something. A couple of hours in, I found the remnants of a stone wall. It looked old, older than any farmhouse ruin I'd seen. Just mossy blocks stacked waist high, stretching maybe 30 feet before vanishing under vines. I marked it and kept climbing. By late afternoon, I stumbled onto a clearing that stopped me cold. It was almost perfectly round, 30 feet across, ringed with trees but stripped bare inside. No shrubs, no fallen limbs, just brittle brown grass pressed flat like it hadn't been disturbed in decades. And in the center, a cairn. A careful stack of pale stones taller than my knee. Resting on top was a carved post, the wood surprisingly fresh. 3 slashes etched vertically inside a crescent. I should have flagged it, taken notes, and moved on. Instead, I crouched close, tracing the grooves with my eyes. The cuts weren't weathered. Someone had carved them in the last year. Maybe the last month. That's when I heard it. A cough. Dry. Sharp. Behind me. I spun so fast my boots slipped in the dirt. No one was there. The clearing's edge was empty, trees still as photographs. I told myself it was echo, my imagination, a trick of air. I packed my gear, hurried down slope, and told myself I'd finish the southern boundary the next morning. I set camp near a rock ledge, ate jerky cold, and kept my boots on. I dozed lightly until the dark thickened. Sometime after midnight, I snapped awake. 3 knocks. Deliberate. On wood. It came from the direction of the cairn. I lay frozen, staring at the nylon above me, heart hammering. Then the sound came again, closer this time, like someone rapping their knuckles against a hollow log. 3 knocks. A pause. 3 more. I sat up, fumbling for my flashlight, and swept the trees. Nothing. But the silence was suffocating again, so deep it rang in my ears. I didn't sleep. I sat with my knife in my lap until the first gray light cut through the trees. The next morning, I forced myself to keep working. My contract didn't leave room for quitting over funny noises. I climbed the ridge, tied new flags, logged tree counts. I told myself to ignore the sick feeling in my stomach. But around noon, I saw something that made me stop cold. Another clearing. Another circle. This one held a deer. Not fresh, its body stiff, curled on its side like it had simply lain down and died. But its antlers had been snapped clean and placed in a straight line beside the body, neat as an offering. I gagged, turned, and practically jogged back down slope. Only the slope didn't end. The paths twisted wrong. My flags were gone, every last one. My GPS froze, then spun aimlessly. My compass needle jittered back and forth. That's when the coughing returned. This time, not behind me. Off to my left, then to my right, then ahead. Always the same dry bark, too close to mistake. I shouted, "Hello? Who's out there?" But the only reply was another cough, closer, and a low rasp of breath that didn't sound entirely human. I stumbled downhill, branches whipping my arms, lungs burning. The forest pressed tight until suddenly I broke into a clearing. And froze. The cairn again. The same carved post. Somehow I had circled back. Panic took over. I dropped my tripod and bolted. I don't remember much of the run, only the constant coughing that flanked me. Never closer than 20 feet, never farther. Once, I swear I felt hot breath against my ear and turned so fast I fell flat on my back. But nothing was there when I scrambled up. Finally, I crashed onto gravel. An old roadbed, washed out but familiar. I followed it at a dead sprint until my truck came into view. Relief hit so hard I nearly sobbed. But the relief died as soon as I saw the door. My driver's side door was hanging open. The glove box was dumped, maps scattered. First aid kit contents spilled across the seat. Nothing stolen, just disturbed, as though someone had been pawing through it and walked away. I climbed in, slammed the locks down, and jammed the key in. Dead. Not even a click. My hands shook as I tried again, sweat stinging my eyes. That's when the coughing started again. Not one voice. Several. Encircling the truck. Moving, always moving, just out of sight among the trees. I dropped my head against the wheel, muttering prayers I hadn't said in years. On the 4th twist of the key, the engine roared to life. I slammed it into reverse, nearly took out a sapling, and fishtailed down the path until asphalt appeared. I didn't stop until I hit a gas station 20 miles away. I sat on the curb drinking a soda I didn't remember buying, hands still trembling too hard to text my supervisor. Later, a ranger told me locals whisper about the Ashwood coughers. Not spirits, not animals, but echoes of settlers who suffocated in a fever epidemic in the 1800s. They say the land swallowed them, that they cough in warning when someone trespasses near their burial circles. But others claim the cough isn't a warning at all. It's an invitation. I laughed at the story in front of him, pretended I didn't believe a word. But I've never gone back to Ashwood, and sometimes, late at night when my house is quiet, I'll hear it again, 3 knocks, then a ragged cough from somewhere beneath the floorboards. When I was 32, I worked as a field medic for a volunteer search and rescue unit out of southern Kentucky. Our crew mostly handled missing hikers, ATV crashes, and the occasional river rescue gone bad. It wasn't glamorous, and it sure didn't pay much, but back then I thought helping people would patch up some holes in me I didn't like to talk about. Anyone who's spent time in the Cumberland forests knows how they feel different from other woods. They're too dense, too quiet, and the ridges twist around each other like a maze that doesn't want you to leave once you've stepped inside. I had learned not to ask too many questions about why people went missing. Folks vanish out there for reasons that aren't always easy to explain. Some step wrong on a slick rock ledge, some panic and walk in circles till exhaustion drops them. But there are cases that never fit. One of them still knots my stomach when I think about it. It was February, brittle cold. The kind of weather where you taste iron in the air and your breath turns silver. Dispatch called around 4 in the afternoon. A 16-year-old girl named Hannah hadn't come back from an overnight trek near Laurel Fork. She'd been camping with her stepfather. He'd gone back toward the truck to grab their food bag, and when he returned, her boots, coat, and backpack were still sitting by the fire pit. But she was gone. We mobilized quick. There were 6 of us, split into pairs, each with radios, flares, and GPS trackers. I was paired with a guy named Mason. He was a couple of years younger than me, still new, all nerves and energy, but he was smart and steady with his hands. The kind of person you wanted when things got ugly. The ground out there isn't friendly. Old limestone caves collapse without warning, streams cut sudden gullies, and the paths twist through rhododendron, so thick it's like crawling through tunnels. Still, I'd worked that stretch enough to picture it blindfolded. Hannah had been wearing a green parka, good for warmth, terrible for being found. We expected to track her in a couple hours. About half an hour into our sweep, Mason spotted something dangling off a briar. A strip of torn parka fabric, still bright, edges sharp. 20 feet farther, we found a mitten crushed into the mud. But there were no drag marks, no sign she'd stumbled. It looked like the woods themselves had plucked pieces of her away. We marked the GPS, called it in, and pressed forward. 10 minutes later, the trees opened into a hollow. Not a meadow, more like a wound in the forest. Oval, 20 yards across, ringed with hemlocks leaning inward as if bowing to something in the center. That something was a massive sycamore. The bark was chalk white, peeling, and it looked bloated, like it had swallowed its own roots. But what froze me wasn't the size. It was the carvings. Dozens of circles, overlapping, precise. Some shallow, some dug so deep the tree bled black sap. They weren't the messy graffiti of kids. They looked deliberate, arranged in a pattern I couldn't decipher. Around the base, the ground was worn bare, as if dozens of feet had shuffled there over decades, but the dirt was smooth, no leaves, no needles, nothing living. Mason knelt, brushed the soil with his glove, and muttered, "Feels packed down, like it's been walked over and over." His voice was low, like he already regretted speaking. I told him we should log it and head back, but he pointed at the slope leading downhill. Boot prints. Small. Uneven, like Hannah had been stumbling or guided. We followed. The tracks zigzagged for a quarter mile before halting at what looked like a collapsed sinkhole. 7 feet across, 5 deep. Inside, sprawled on his back, was Hannah. Except it didn't look like her, not fully. She was soaked, hair plastered to her skull, lips pale. Her arms lay stiff at her sides, as if someone had placed her there. Mason jumped down before I could stop him. He touched her wrist, then flinched. "She's freezing," he said. "But she's wet." His breath fogged in the air. "There's no water down here." "Where the hell?" Her eyes snapped open, pupils blown wide, swallowing all color. She stared straight through Mason, as though he wasn't real. Then her mouth opened, and a sound tore out, garbled, metallic, like an old CB radio catching half a signal. Words half-formed, broken by static. My teeth ached at the frequency. Mason froze. Then Hannah's limbs began to jerk, not like a seizure, but like a puppet yanked by invisible strings. Each movement sharp, deliberate. The static rose higher, piercing. My vision buzzed. Mason clutched his head, shouting. Hannah collapsed limp again, eyes open but unblinking, mouth twitching with that radio buzz. We hauled her out. I wanted to wait for the medevac, but Mason insisted we move. The radios barely worked, crackling with interference, but we managed to get enough out for a chopper. When it came, Hannah never moved. At the hospital, they said she breathed, she swallowed water, but she never spoke again. She just stared, lips parting now and then, as if whispering to someone no one else could hear. Mason unraveled after that. He stopped answering calls, stopped showing up. 2 weeks later, he appeared at my door looking like a ghost, skin gray, eyes bloodshot. He said every time he shut his eyes, he saw the sycamore. Said the carved rings glowed faintly, pulsed like a heartbeat. He swore he woke one morning to find a perfect circle etched into the inside of his bedroom window, carved deep into the glass. He lived alone. He quit the next day, packed his gear, and left the county. I should have left it there, but I couldn't. I needed to prove to myself it had been panic, exhaustion, imagination. So one afternoon in March, I hiked back. Alone. The sycamore was still there. The carvings had spread higher up the trunk, deeper, darker. The dirt at its base was churned like fresh footprints had circled it all night. I lifted my camera, snapped a picture, then froze. Down near the roots was a new carving, raw, fresh enough that sap still wept from it. Not a circle this time. A name. Mason. I left without another photo. Never told anyone. But sometimes, when I'm on call with new recruits, I pass along one piece of advice. I tell them, if you ever stumble on a sycamore carved with circles, turn around. Don't follow prints. Don't call into the hollow. Don't touch whoever you think you've found. Some things out here want you to reach for them. And if you do, they'll never let you go. I was 38 when I took the contract job that nearly broke me. By trade, I'm an electrician, the kind of guy people call when their breaker boxes hum or their lights flicker in ways they shouldn't. But I'd been laid off after the company I worked for in Knoxville folded, and bills don't pay themselves. When a property manager from a faded summer camp in eastern Tennessee offered a month-long maintenance gig, I said yes before asking the right questions. The camp was called Laurel Springs Retreat, though no one had retreated there in decades. It sat halfway up the Unaka Range, where switchback roads got so narrow you had to pray no one was coming down as you climbed up. They'd closed the place in the late 90s after a landslide blocked the main access road. Only recently had they cleared a new gravel path and started whispering about restoration. My job was simple: check the wiring in the old bunkhouses, patch up outlets, and make sure the water pumps ran without sparking. They gave me one of the upper cabins to sleep in, told me it'd be easier than driving down every night. Cabin D was mine. It sat at the farthest corner of the property, perched where the tree pushed hard against the rotting wood. The manager, a woman named Alice, warned me with a half-smile. Nobody liked staying in D. Kids said it was too close to the woods. I laughed it off. Moldy walls and leaky pipes were what scared me, not trees. The first days went by quietly. I kept a routine: work until dusk, heat up whatever kin junk I had, and fall asleep watching old DVDs on a battery-powered player. No cell service, no internet, nothing but my own thoughts. Peaceful in theory, but silence has a way of chewing on you after a while. It was the third night when I stopped believing it was just silence. I was spooning chili straight from the can when something smacked the side of the cabin. Not a tree branch, not an animal brushing past. It was a flat, deliberate strike. I froze, spoon hovering, listening. Nothing followed. When I stepped outside with my flashlight, the beam cut across black trees and empty gravel. My breath looked too white in the cold spring air, and for a second I thought I heard something shift out past the pines. Then silence again. The next night it happened twice. One hard knock near the front, then another on the back wall. I grabbed the heavy wrench I kept on the counter and stormed outside, light sweeping like a prison guard. Nothing. Only the faint stink of wet moss mixed with something ranker, something like spoiled meat. I circled the cabin and stopped dead when my boot scuffed something. A tower of stones, 7 of them, stacked like a child's toy pyramid just behind the cabin. I kicked it over. Rocks scattered into the weeds. When morning came, The stack was back, taller. 9 stones now, balanced too neatly to be random. That was the night I stopped trying to sleep. I sat in a chair by the front window, flashlight in one hand, wrench in the other. Sometime past midnight, movement flickered between the trees. Tall, narrow, bent at the shoulders like it couldn't quite stand upright. The second my light hit it, it slid out of view, vanishing behind the bark like it had been swallowed whole. 10 minutes later it reappeared further down the ridge, watching. I shoved my bed against the cabin door, blocked the windows with what little furniture I had. It didn't matter. Around 2 in the morning, I heard the doorknob click. Not rattle, not shake. Click like someone was easing it open as carefully as they could. My light snapped on, shaking in my grip. Nothing, but a slow scrape followed across the porch, long and deliberate, like claws dragging wood. By dawn I unlocked the door with hands that wouldn't stop trembling. The porch rail bore 4 fresh gouges, deep enough to peel with splinters like curled fingernails. Too far apart to be a raccoon or coyote. Too sharp to be bear claws. I drove down the mountain that morning, straight to a ranger outpost. Showed them the photos I'd taken. The young ranger squinted, shrugged, and said maybe a black bear. I asked if bears had the habit of stacking rocks in towers or turning doorknobs. He didn't have an answer, but I went back. Bills, remember? Tools, gear, my paycheck depended on it. When I unlocked Cabin D the next morning, the furniture I'd barricaded with was shifted. Not thrown around, just moved. The bed had been dragged back from the door, not to its old spot, but just enough to clear the entrance. And on the mattress sat a new stack of stones, smaller this time, only 5, balanced perfectly in the morning light. That was the first time I thought about quitting. My pride kept me from it. I told myself some punk teenagers were sneaking up at night, laughing at the idiot electrician who scared easy. I tried to convince myself as I worked through the wiring of the mess hall. But that night, when I sat in the dark with every tool stacked around me, I realized it wasn't kids. Because kids don't whisper your name through the cracks in the wall. The first whisper came soft, like wind slipping through leaves. My own name stretched too thin. Daniel. I bolted upright, flashlight slicing across the room. Nothing. The woods had gone so quiet it rang in my ears. I didn't sleep. The next day I cornered Alice at the ranger's shack, demanded answers. She didn't blink. Said she'd heard stories, old campfire tales. Something they called the Pale Watcher. Tall, thin, never speaking except to mimic. Didn't hurt people unless you gave it something. Food. Trinkets. Attention. You gave it that already, she said, her voice flat. I packed my things. Left Cabin D with the bed still pushed crooked, stones still sitting neat on the sheets. I didn't tell Alice what I'd really seen. I didn't tell her about the figure ducking behind trees every time light touched it, or the whispers that weren't mine. I just said I was more comfortable sleeping in my truck. That should have been the end. But it wasn't. Even parked down the lower road, I'd still hear it some nights. A single knock echoing down the gravel, or the scent of rot carried on the wind. Sometimes, when headlights from a passing ranger truck cut through the trees, I'd swear I saw something lean just out of view. Last I heard, they hired contractors to redo the place. A crew out of Johnson City came up, lasted less than a week. One of the men complained of migraines so bad he couldn't stand straight. Another swore his tools went missing only to reappear stacked like cairns in the middle of the bunkhouse floor. They boarded up Cabin D not long after. I drive past the turnoff sometimes when work takes me near Unicoi County. The sign for Laurel Springs is faded, nearly swallowed by kudzu. But every time, without fail, my stomach knots. Because I know if I were to walk up that gravel road again, Cabin D would still be waiting. And in its window, if I looked too long, something thin and pale might be waiting too, patient, silent, remembering the attention I gave it. I was 24 the fall it happened, still clinging to the idea that the outdoors would somehow make me into the kind of person I wanted to be. I'd been working part-time at a nature center in Kentucky, mostly giving presentations to school kids about owls and soil samples, but I wanted something more rugged to put on my graduate applications. When the chance came to volunteer for a backwoods survey project in the Appalachian Plateau of eastern Kentucky, I jumped on it. A week in the deep hills, shadowing a ranger, collecting ecological data. It sounded like the field experience I thought admissions committees wanted to see. The man they paired me with was called Harlan. He introduced himself by name once, never offered a handshake, and then didn't bother repeating it when I asked if I'd heard him right. He was somewhere in his 50s, I guessed, with a wiry frame and a face full of old scars that made his expression unreadable. His clothes looked as if they'd been bought decades ago. Faded green jacket, canvas pants smeared with clay, boots that looked molded to his feet. He wasn't unfriendly exactly, but the silence that clung to him was heavier than normal reserve. The drive to the outpost took nearly 4 hours, most of it winding through dirt switchbacks and half-forgotten mining roads. Harlan barely spoke except to point out things I would never have noticed. A dead ash stand collapsing on a slope, a trail of scat from a bobcat, a ridge where turkeys roost. His eyes never seemed to rest. They were always sliding from one treeline to the next, like he was expecting something to step out and challenge him. By the time the pavement ended and we bounced over a rusted truss bridge into the real backcountry, my phone had already lost service. Harlan didn't even check his. The outpost was little more than a shack clinging to the side of the ridge, 2 rooms and a porch that tilted under its own weight. The generator out back looked functional, but he said we wouldn't use it unless absolutely necessary. Too noisy, drew the wrong kind of attention. He took the cot by the wall without asking. I got the bunk that sagged in the corner. His only concession to comfort was a wood stove, which he fed obsessively, like he trusted fire more than the walls around us. The first days felt like the adventure I'd wanted. We spent long hours trekking through steep hollows and ridgelines, checking camera traps, noting tree diseases, spotting signs of deer and bear. Harlan wrote everything in a small waterproof log, scribbling without looking down, like the woods were dictating to him, and he was just keeping up. He moved differently than anyone I'd ever hiked with, less like a man forcing his way through the brush, and more like he was following an old rhythm, each step measured and inevitable. When I asked him if he'd ever been charged by a black bear, he only muttered, "They don't bother me," with the flatness of someone who wasn't boasting but stating something fundamental. The third morning broke the routine. He woke me before dawn with a rough shake and pushed a thermos into my hands without explanation. We hiked hard, no trail, just cutting through laurel thickets and rockfall gullies until I was gasping to keep up. About a mile in, he crouched and raised a thermal monocular to his eye, then passed it to me without a word. I lifted it, squinting into the clearing below us. 6 shapes glowed bright against the cold background, human-shaped, upright, standing in a wide ring. They weren't moving, not swaying, not shifting. Just there. "Hunters?" I whispered. Harlan didn't answer. I pulled the monocular down to check with my naked eye, but the clearing looked empty, just fog tangled in the pines. When I looked back through the lens, the figures were still there, heat bright and impossibly still. Harlan eventually muttered, "Too warm. Too long." Then, without warning, all 6 turned in unison and walked into the densest part of the forest. Not fast, not slow, just steady, vanishing into cover like they had rehearsed it. He pulled the monocular from my hands, shoved it in his pocket, and stood. "We're done here." His voice was clipped, his eyes never leaving the treeline. On the way back, he kept glancing behind us, his neck working like a coiled spring. He wasn't panicking, it was worse. He was evaluating, tracking, adjusting his pace in little increments. When we reached the shack again, he locked every window, even the half-broken bathroom one that barely opened. He drew the curtains and sat still for a long moment, listening to the silence of the landline before putting it back on the receiver. Finally, he looked at me and said only, "Stay inside tonight, no matter what you hear." That night was wrong from the beginning. If you've ever camped deep in the mountains, you know there are always sounds. Insects humming, owls screeching, leaves rustling. But when darkness fell, the woods muted themselves. Not silence, a hollow absence, as if the world had been switched off. The void pressed against my ears until my heartbeat felt deafening. Around 2 in the morning, Harlan nudged me awake and motioned me to the back window. Through the small slit in the curtain, I saw a figure standing at the treeline. Naked, hairless. Its skin glowed faintly in the moonlight, pallid and waxen. It faced the shack, motionless. No blinking, no shifting weight. My throat closed up. "What the hell is that?" I managed to whisper. Harlan said nothing. He just watched. We stayed like that for 20 minutes until the thing turned slowly and walked back into the woods. When dawn came, he was already packing. "We're leaving," he said. No debate. I asked what those things were, what we'd seen in the scope. He paused, hands frozen on his pack straps, and muttered, "They don't like eyes on them." We started down the trail, but the forest wasn't the same. Landmarks had shifted. A sycamore he had notched on the way and was bare now. The slope leaned the wrong direction. Even the ridgeline felt skewed. His calm broke once, a low curse under his breath, too quiet to be for me. After hours of downhill stumbling, we found the truck, or what remained of it. The metal skin was carved with deep gouges. The hood bowed inward as if something massive had dropped from above. The windows were intact, but smeared across the insides were dozens of small handprints. Child-sized. Bare. Harlan didn't comment. He just started the engine, face locked forward, and drove us out of those hills. He didn't stop until we were back in the ranger office in town. When I asked how I should report the week, he said flatly, "Standard wildlife survey. No incidents." 3 days later, he resigned. No explanation. He simply disappeared from the department roster, like he'd been erased. I tried to rationalize it afterward, searching through online forums, message boards, threads about Appalachian disappearances. The region we'd been in had a reputation. Too many missing persons for the population size, vanishing without signs of struggle. People called them many things, but one phrase kept surfacing: the hollow watchers. Human shapes that stood too still, that mirrored but never mimicked, that erased trails behind them. One post claimed they were remnants of settlers who had wandered into old mining tunnels and never returned, now hollowed of everything but the instinct to stare. Another insisted they were older than the mines, older than the Cherokee stories, born from the earth itself to keep intruders blind and lost. I don't know what version to believe. I only know what I saw. I haven't set foot in those hills again. When I drive past the edge of that region, I don't even look out the window. Sometimes, though, late at night when I glance into a dark stretch of woods off the highway, I think I see a pale figure standing perfectly still between the trees. Watching, waiting, never blinking, and every time, I look away first. I was 27 when the company sent me out to the Cumberland Plateau of eastern Tennessee. A job I thought would be nothing more than a paycheck and a good excuse to spend a few days in the woods. I wasn't a forester or surveyor by trade, but I'd been working with a land management firm that bought up rural acreage for future development. My task was simple enough: hike into a newly purchased tract of forest, map the boundaries by hand, and note anything unusual. 3 days, maybe 4, and then I'd be back in my apartment eating takeout and watching football. The area was called Dry Branch Hollow, a speck on the map a few miles from a town even smaller. I don't think you'd find more than a gas station, a diner, and 2 churches if you drove through. When I asked locals for directions, half of them didn't even know what property I was talking about. The others just shrugged and told me the place had been left alone for good reason. That should have been my first warning, but I brushed it off as backwoods superstition. The access road ended in a washed-out gully where I left the truck. From there, it was nothing but forest, steep ridges folding into valleys like crumpled paper. My GPS cut out within the first hour, so I reverted to a compass and topo map. At first, it felt like any other survey job. Long stretches of silence broken by the creak of my pack straps or the crunch of leaves underfoot. By the time I stumbled across a rotting foundation from what must have been an old homestead, the sky was already thinning toward dusk. I made camp on a ridge beside a dry creek bed. The soil was cracked and pale, the kind of place that hadn't seen water in years. I boiled some noodles on a tiny camp stove, listening for the usual background music of the woods. But there wasn't any. No crickets, no owls, not even the faint tapping of beetles under the bark. It was too quiet, and not in a peaceful way. It felt staged, like I had stepped onto a movie set where the sound crew hadn't hit play. The next morning, I packed up and moved east toward the interior of the property. A couple of hours in, I spotted something leaning against a gnarled chestnut oak, a ladder stand, rusted and half-collapsed, strapped 10 feet up but ready to fall at the next storm. Beneath it was a scatter of twigs and branches arranged in crude figures. Not carved, not shaped with tools, just snapped and twisted into things that looked vaguely like animals. One looked uncomfortably human, arms crooked, head bent forward like it was listening. The air prickled around me. I took a photo but didn't touch anything. By midday, I reached a strange clearing, a wide oval of bare stone ringed tight with hardwoods. No stumps, no scars from logging, just an open patch that seemed untouched. I was planting a marker flag when I noticed faint lines carved into the stone, not a spiral exactly, but interlocking arcs, like someone had traced overlapping runes. They were fresh, edges still sharp, and the grooves were free of moss. It wasn't natural. I wrote a note in my logbook, though my hand was shaking. I set up camp a couple miles north that evening, on flat ground where the wind barely reached. Just after dusk, I killed my lantern and settled into the tent when I heard it. A sharp crack, the sound of a heavy branch snapping under weight. Not the quick skitter of a raccoon, but something larger. Then silence. A long silence, too long. When I finally started to relax, another sound followed. A groan, low and metallic, as if someone were dragging a pipe across stone. It stretched out for several seconds, then ended as abruptly as it began. I gripped my folding knife and stayed awake until my eyes burned. By the third day, I'd had enough. I was supposed to finish charting, but all I wanted was to get out. My compass began spinning without direction, and when I pulled out the backup, the needle wavered like it was drunk. I climbed a ridge to try my GPS again, but the sky above seemed wrong. The light was gray and diffuse, shadows blurred like I was looking through fogged glass. I told myself it was just cloud cover, but the sun hadn't shown itself in hours. That was when I came across the arch. Two young maples bent toward each other, trunks curving unnaturally until they touched, forming a doorway tall enough for me to walk through. No ropes, no wires, nothing holding them that way. At their roots were piles of stones, 5 or 6 apiece, stacked neatly like offerings. For reasons I still can't explain, I stepped through. The moment I did, my chest seized like ice water had been poured into my lungs. It only lasted a few seconds, but it left me shaking. I didn't go back through. Afterward, nothing lined up. I walked north for nearly an hour, but somehow circled back to the stone clearing with the carved arcs. I tied fluorescent tape to a tree, chose another direction, and walked straight without deviating. 40 minutes later, the same tree with the tape appeared on my left. My throat tightened. I tried again, this time downhill, but the forest folded back in on itself like a hallway of mirrors. When panic finally took over, I ran. Branches whipped at my face, thorns tore my sleeves, but I didn't stop until I tripped on a root and slammed into the ground. My hand split open on the rocks, and when I pulled it back, the blood was dark and thick, sluggish as if it didn't want to leave me. That was when I heard the dragging sound again, wet, heavy, pulling itself across the forest floor. It came closer, slow and patient. I staggered downhill and caught sight of a glow through the trees. Relief surged. I thought it must be another camper, maybe a ranger. The glow flickered orange, like firelight. I barreled toward it, but no matter how far I went, the flame never seemed closer. It hung in the distance, bobbing slightly, always out of reach. Finally, I stopped to catch my breath and realized it wasn't a campfire at all. It was a lantern, a single flame suspended in midair, with no pole, no hand to carry it. I forced myself closer, within a dozen feet. The flame flickered once, then went out. When I spun around, my stomach dropped. I was back in the clearing with the carved arcs, standing in the center without remembering how I got there. Everything after that is fractured. I remember crawling under a deadfall tree, wrapping myself in my tarp, praying for daylight. At some point, exhaustion knocked me out. When I opened my eyes, pale morning light filtered through the branches, and a thin stream burbled nearby. I followed it west until the trees began to thin. Hours later, I stumbled onto an old logging road where a ranger on an ATV found me. He asked what I was doing out there, and I told him I got turned around, that my gear failed. I didn't mention the arch, or the lantern, or the groaning thing in the hills. Back in town, I learned the company had decided against developing the land. Officially, they claimed the terrain was too remote, too costly. But I think they knew. Since then, I've read what I could. Old county records, folklore blogs, scanned copies of regional journals. That hollow has a reputation. People talk about the hollow lights, lanterns that appear without carriers, guiding lost travelers in circles until they collapse from exhaustion. Some say they're will-o'-the-wisps born from methane pockets. Others swear they're older, tied to miners who went missing in collapsed shafts. And there are stories of the listening trees, bent and twisted into arches where the forest takes notice of anyone who passes beneath. Once you've been acknowledged, the land won't let you go easily. I haven't set foot in Tennessee since. Sometimes, though, when I close my eyes at night, I see that floating lantern, bobbing in the dark, waiting for me to follow again. And when I wake, I'm never certain I really left those woods at all. Somewhere along the stretch of ridges south of Asheville that most hikers avoid, because the trails cut sharp and the roads wash out after every storm. I wasn't a ranger or even much of an outdoorsman, but my graduate work in environmental engineering hadn't turned into a steady paycheck, and I needed something to keep me afloat. A friend of a friend passed along a short-term opening with a conservation contractor. Trail remediation, they called it. Paid by the week, housing provided if I didn't mind a tent. They paired me with a man named Caleb, mid-30s, quiet to the point of discomfort. His voice had the rough edges of someone who didn't bother speaking unless absolutely necessary. He'd been doing seasonal trail work for years, bouncing around between different national forests, and he didn't seem impressed to have me foisted on him. Our job was to clear a forgotten route along a ridge called Carter's Spine, a narrow path that used to connect down to the valley, but was closed decades ago after a slide. The Forest Service wanted it reopened as part of a new loop system. It was 7 miles from the nearest access road. That meant camping low, hauling tools up every morning, hacking through brush and resetting switchbacks until dusk. Hard physical work. That part one was prepared for. What I wasn't prepared for was the silence. The woods out there didn't sound alive. I've done enough camping to know you usually hear something, insects, a flick of wings, the dry chatter of squirrels. But from the first evening, it felt like someone had hit mute on the entire landscape. Caleb noticed too. On our second day, he stopped mid-swing with his axe and just stared upward, listening. "You hear that?" he asked. I shook my head. "Hear what?" "That's the problem." He went back to chopping, but kept glancing up at the canopy as though expecting something to drop down. The ridge gave us other reminders that this place hadn't been touched in years. An old fire pit caved in, moss choking the stones. Nearby, little stacks of rocks, each carefully balanced, no taller than a foot. There were maybe a dozen of them, set in a half circle. I slowed, unwilling to walk through them. Caleb didn't care. He stepped right past, snapped a picture on his phone, and grinned like it was just another oddity. I couldn't explain why, but the longer I looked at them, the tighter my stomach felt. That night, sitting by our camp stove, he said, "Place doesn't want to be reopened. You can feel it." He half smiled, but it wasn't a joke. The next morning something new was waiting. Right where the path started, a bundle of sticks bound with twine was shoved upright in the soil. Not a pile, not random deadfall, a bundle tied deliberate, like someone had left it for us. I told Caleb to leave it. He rolled his eyes and pitched it into the brush. By the end of that day, we'd hit a section where the ridge narrowed to a shelf, one side sheer rock, the other a drop into Laurel Hell. Caleb led with rope and pitons while I brought the gear behind. When I rounded the bend, he was crouched, staring at the ground. In the center of the trail lay a rabbit, perfectly intact. No blood, no bite marks, no struggle. Its legs tucked neatly beneath it, as if it had just stopped. The eyes stared glassy into the dirt. Between its teeth was a single red feather, thin and curved. Caleb's voice was low when he said, "That wasn't here 5 minutes ago." We left it untouched, walking faster after that. The following days only grew stranger. The bright ribbons we'd tied to trees as markers began vanishing. Not shredded, not fallen, just gone. Whole stretches stripped clean overnight. We knew animals couldn't reach some of the higher ones. Caleb started carving marks into trunks with his knife, 3 deep lines. The sound of the blade against the wood made my jaw tighten, like the forest was reacting to every cut. By the 5th day, the air itself felt altered. The stillness was thicker, like it had substance. I thought I caught sight of someone in the trees, a flash of crimson between trunks, but when I turned, it was gone. Caleb paused a few minutes later and asked, "You hear that?" I was about to say no when I did. It was faint, almost like wind through branches, but steadier. A tune. Someone humming. Female, high and thin, threading through the silence. It lasted only seconds before cutting off. Caleb didn't comment, and neither did I. We pushed higher up the ridge until we broke into a clearing we hadn't seen on maps. It wasn't large, maybe 40 yards across, but at its center stood a single oak older than anything around it. The trunk was swollen, split, and scarred with carvings. Not initials, not trail blazes. Symbols gouged deep, curling lines and intersecting slashes I didn't recognize. Around its base were dozens of those balanced stone stacks. More than before. Twice as many. Caleb walked straight to the oak and pressed his hand against the bark. "These are new," he muttered. His fingers traced the grooves. The air changed then. Not colder, not darker, heavier, as though the weight of the entire ridge leaned down upon us. My ears filled like I was underwater. I turned to speak, but before I could, a voice slid through the clearing. A woman's voice. Singing. Not words, not exactly. Just a line, lilting and broken, the cadence of a lullaby looped too many times. It wasn't coming from the trees. It wasn't coming from anywhere. It was just present, inside the air itself. Caleb's face drained of color. We didn't discuss it. We dropped everything, ropes, axes, markers, and bolted downslope. My chest burned, my knees buckled on loose rock, but neither of us slowed until camp. That night, neither of us slept. By dawn, his resolve had cracked. He scribbled a note on the hood of my truck. "I'm done. Don't go back up." By the time I crawled out of my tent, he was gone. I should have left too. Instead, I convinced myself I needed to finish the job. At the very least, I needed photos and trail notes to justify the week. So I climbed alone. The path looked different. Wider but older. As though I was walking on something that hadn't been cut in decades, but had existed long before any crew came here. Ribbons that looked like ours were tied, but wrong. The knots backwards, the strips hanging at odd angles. On trunks, the same 3 slashes Caleb carved now appeared everywhere, but sharper, too clean, as if something had imitated his work and improved it. When I reached the clearing, my breath caught. The oak was gone. No trunk, no stones, no carvings. Just flattened grass, brittle and gray. I turned in circles, map clutched in one hand, compass in the other. The needle spun uselessly. Then, faint and fragile, I heard the humming again. Not far this time. Behind me. I froze, too afraid to turn. The sound grew closer, threading through the trees, soft and deliberate. The same line over and over like it had been waiting for me to come back. I don't remember running. I don't remember descending the ridge. My memory skips, fractured into flashes. Branches tearing my arms, blood in my mouth from biting my tongue, shadows flickering in the corners of my vision. At some point, I must have blacked out because when I opened my eyes again, I was in my truck at the fire road. My hands were filthy, nails rimmed with soil, but I don't recall driving down. I never saw Caleb again. I did the bare minimum for the report. No photos of the clearing, no mention of the carvings or the humming. Just terrain notes, slope angles, estimated mileage. A month later, the project was shelved indefinitely. Locals call Carter's spine cursed, though few use that word outright. I found scraps online, old forums, grainy scans of regional histories, talking about the Red Choir. Travelers who hear women's voices on ridges where no one lives. Sometimes singing, sometimes laughing. Always just out of sight. The stories go back over a century, and the endings are rarely clean. People wander in, don't come back, or they return hollow-eyed, unable to explain where the days went. I tell myself I made it out, that I'm safe. But sometimes, when I'm driving back roads at night, I catch the faintest trace of humming under the engine noise. And once, in the reflection of the side mirror, I thought I saw someone walking just behind the truck. Barefoot, red fabric trailing the dirt. I don't use that mirror anymore.